Some musicians don't just create art, they predict their own endings. Today, we share 6 haunting stories of legendary artists who saw death coming and left behind evidence of their visions. Listen for the clues hidden in their final days, then share your guesses in the comments. She said it so casually, like she was reading tomorrow's weather forecast. 27 is when it'll happen, she told the interviewer, sipping her drink in that smoky Camden pub. That's when they all go, isn't it? The interviewer laughed nervously, but she wasn't joking. She'd been making these predictions since her first record hit, always with that same detached certainty. London's soul scene had never seen anyone quite like her. Raw talent wrapped in chaos, a voice that could break your heart while telling you exactly how it got broken. The tabloids followed her everywhere, hoping to catch her next spiral. But they missed the real story happening in those small recording studios in North London. Between the public meltdowns and failed rehab attempts, she was documenting everything, turning her descent into songs that felt like prophecies. Her producer noticed it first, how her lyrics had shifted from love gone wrong to something darker. It's like she's writing her own obituary, he told the studio manager one night after she'd laid down another track about resistance and surrender. The songs became increasingly autobiographical, each one a chapter in the story of her own unraveling. She wrote about the demons that followed her home, about the lovers who enabled her worst instincts, about the fame that felt like a noose tightening with each hit single. Her parents tried interventions, her friends begged her to get help, but she'd just smile that knowing smile and say, there's a clock ticking, love, and I can hear it running down. The last recording sessions were hard to watch. Her voice, that incredible instrument that had moved millions, was growing fragile. But even then, there was a strange power in her weakness, like she was channeling every bit of pain into one final testament. Her band learned to work around her schedule, grabbing moments of clarity between the chaos, piecing together songs that felt more like confessions than pop hits. She kept a diary during those final months. The entries mixed song lyrics with prophecies, drawings of clocks all stopped at 27, lists of musicians who'd joined that infamous club before her. Her last performance was at a small club in Camden, the kind of venue she could have filled 100 times over in her prime. She sang songs about resistance that night, about fighting battles you know you'll lose, about finding freedom in surrender. 3 days later, they found her in her London flat. The diary lay open on her nightstand, its final entry a simple line about joining that exclusive club she'd predicted all along. The songs she left behind tell the story she'd been writing for years, a slow-motion prophecy set to a soul beat. Her last album, released after her death, feels less like a collection of songs and more like a map of her journey to 27. Critics called it haunting, but those who knew her said it was more like a planned farewell, each track a stepping stone to an ending she'd seen coming all along. Years later, fans still gather outside that Camden pub, where she first predicted her fate. They play her songs, the ones that told her story before it ended, and wonder if she chose her ending or just saw it coming. Maybe the truth is in those final recordings, in a voice that sounds less like it's fighting demons and more like it's preparing to join them. Just another prophecy fulfilled in the city that watched her burn too bright, too fast, exactly as she said she would. Can you identify this soul singer who predicted her own fate in Camden's smoky pubs? Leave your answer in the comments below. The cameras rolled as he directed another scene of his own death. Standing in the cemetery, surrounded by candles and mourners, he watched his vision of the future unfold through the lens. The director thought he was being artistic, provocative, but this wasn't art, it was preparation. The death threats had started coming 6 months ago. At first, they were just paper trails, anonymous notes slipped under hotel doors, cryptic messages left with his security team. But lately, they'd grown bolder, more specific. He'd started keeping a journal, documenting every strange car that followed him, every suspicious face in the crowd, every warning that crossed his path. His security team said he was being paranoid. Maybe they were right. Success in the rap game always came with enemies, but this felt different. more personal, more inevitable. The studio became his sanctuary. He recorded constantly, sometimes 16, 20 hours straight. His producers were amazed by his output, but they didn't understand the urgency driving him. Every track felt like time running out, like words that needed to be said before the chance was gone forever. The vision started in July, dreams so vivid they followed him into daylight, says. Always ending the same way, says. 4 shots, a car window, the warm Las Vegas night turning cold. He started filming himself, talking directly to the camera about his fears, his predictions, his acceptance of what felt increasingly unavoidable. "If something happens to me," he'd say, staring into the lens with intense eyes, "I need people to know it wasn't random." His inner circle worried about his obsession with death. They tried to convince him to take a break there and maybe leave the country for a while, but he knew running wouldn't change what was coming. Instead, he poured everything into his work, creating albums worth of material, filming videos that felt more like prophecies than entertainment. Each one contained hidden messages, clues and warnings about what he saw approaching. The night it happened, everything felt staged, like a scene he'd already filmed. The warm Vegas air, the black BMW, the white Cadillac pulling alongside at the light. Time slowed as he saw the window rolling down, just like in his dreams. The first shot shattered glass, the next 3 found flesh. As consciousness faded, his last thought wasn't of fear or regret, but of all the breadcrumbs he'd left behind, the videos, the journals, the recordings, a trail of evidence pointing to this moment. In the years since, fans have dissected every frame of those final videos, seeing the signs he planted there, the cemetery scenes, the prophetic lyrics, the knowing look in his eyes as he sang at his own funeral again and again. Some say he was manifesting his fate. Others believe he was trying to prevent it. But the truth might be simpler: a man who saw death approaching and chose to face it on his own terms, leaving behind a mystery that would keep his story alive long after the cameras stopped rolling. His last music video was released after his death. In it, he walks through his own funeral one final time, a prophecy fulfilled in the most tragic way. But maybe that's what he wanted, to direct his own ending, to turn his death into something more than just another tragedy in a city that collects them. Even now, decades later, people study the clues he left behind, trying to understand how he knew. But perhaps the real question isn't how he saw it coming, but why he chose to turn his prophecy into art, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs that would keep people searching for answers long after the last shot was fired. As you piece together the clues from his prophetic videos and final night in Vegas, drop your theory about this rapper's identity in the comments below. The sketchbook was filling up with ghosts, not the scary kind, but self-portraits in translucent form floating through Seattle's rain-soaked streets. He'd started drawing them obsessively in the winter of '94 between tours and recording sessions. His wife found them unsettling, especially the ones where he'd drawn himself at different ages, always transparent, always 27. The fame had come too fast, too heavy. Success felt like drowning in expectations. Every show, every album, every interview pulling him further from who he really was. The pain didn't help. His stomach condition had doctors baffled, prescribing medications that dulled everything except the constant ache in his gut. The house in Seattle became his fortress and his prison. Dark curtains blocked the constant gray skies, while he filled notebook after notebook with sketches and scattered thoughts. His bandmates worried when they saw the drawings, especially the recurring theme of the 27 Club, that infamous list of musicians who never saw 28. He talked about them like old friends waiting for him: Morrison, Joplin, Jones. The ghost drawings evolved as winter deepened. Now they showed him floating through famous rock venues, hovering above crowds, always with that same peaceful expression he never wore in real life. His producer found him one day, surrounded by the sketches, talking about how certain musicians become more pure, more real, after they leave their bodies behind. The recording sessions became increasingly difficult. He'd show up with new lyrics about crossing over, about finding peace in absence. The label executives exchanged worried glances, But the songs were brilliant, even if they felt more like messages from the other side than radio hits. In early spring, he escaped to the greenhouse, his one sanctuary on the property. There, surrounded by growing things, he wrote his final thoughts. The note quoted another musician's words about burning out versus fading away, though he'd been writing his own version of that message in his art for months. When they found him, the sketchbook lay open to his last drawing, a ghost figure floating above the Seattle skyline, finally free from pain, from expectations, from the weight of being everyone's voice except his own. The art he left behind tells the story his words couldn't. Dozens of self-portraits as a spirit, each one a premonition of his transformation. His final album, released after his death, carried echoes of those drawings in every track. Songs about transcendence, about crossing thresholds, about finding in death the peace that life had denied him. The house in Seattle became a pilgrimage site for fans seeking to understand his visions. They'd stand outside in the rain, looking up at the greenhouse where he spent his final days, wondering if he'd known all along that he'd joined that exclusive club of artists who burned too bright to last. The ghost drawings are in a museum now, protected behind glass like holy relics. Visitors stand before them for hours, studying each translucent self-portrait, seeing in those sketches the story of a man who documented his own haunting before becoming a ghost himself. Some say he planned it all. The drawings, the lyrics, the carefully chosen quote at the end. Others believe he was simply showing the world what he saw coming, his art becoming prophecy in the most tragic way. But maybe the truth is in those peaceful expressions he drew on his ghost faces. The serenity he could only imagine in death finally becoming his reality at 27. Yet, looking at the trail of ghostly self-portraits and his obsession with Seven, who do you think this grunge icon might be? Share your guess below. The morning dew still clung to the leaves when he first saw the signs. Standing in his garden in Kingston, that sacred space where he'd written so many of his greatest songs, he noticed something different about his favorite herb plants. The leaves had withered overnight into distinct patterns, not random decay, but shapes that sent a chill down his spine. "Jah guide me," he whispered, recognizing the ancient symbols he'd studied in his Rastafarian teachings. Symbols of exodus, of judgment, of death. He wasn't a man who scared easily. Growing up in Trenchtown had taught him to face life's hardships with a warrior's spirit. But this was different. This felt like a message meant just for him. His mornings had always started the same way for years. Meditation at dawn, followed by a walk through his garden, tending to his herbs while humming melodies that would later become songs that moved millions. Music wasn't just his gift. It was his direct line to Jah, his way of spreading light in a world too often darkened by greed and corruption. For weeks, he'd felt eyes watching him, even in his own yard. The unease had started small, a misplaced notebook here, a rearranged recording set up there. He'd brushed it off as road fatigue from the last tour where they'd played to the biggest crowds of their career. His message of unity and resistance had reached far beyond the shores of Jamaica, touching souls across continents. But standing there in the morning light, those twisted leaves spoke a truth he couldn't ignore. Someone was moving against him, someone close. The signs led him to dive deeper into his faith, spending long nights with his Bible, writing lyrics that came to him like fever dreams. He'd always been spiritual, but now he was consumed by it, seeing connections between ancient prophecies and the shadows gathering around him. His wife noticed first, watching him pace the halls at night, muttering about lions and Babylon and judgment. She tried to convince him to rest, but how could he explain that rest felt like surrender? His band noticed the change in him too. "You're different, brother." The music too, deeper somehow. They weren't wrong. Every song that poured out of him now felt like prophecy, warnings wrapped in melody. The new album was unlike anything he'd created before. Songs about betrayal, redemption, and the thin line between this world and the next. His producers called it his masterpiece, but they didn't know what drove him to create it. The threats started coming a month after he found the signs. Small warnings at first, cryptic messages left in his studio, references to biblical passages about fallen kings. His security team found fetishes, dark objects meant to curse and bind, hidden in the corners of his compound. Each discovery only pushed him deeper into the music, turning his fear into anthems of defiance and spiritual warfare. Then one night he caught them, three of his most trusted friends, in his home studio mixing something into his tea. Men who'd been with him since the early days, when they'd all shared one room and dreamed of changing the world with their music. He confronted them, and the truth spilled out like blood. Money, power, jealousy. The oldest stories in the world. They'd been slowly poisoning him, not to kill, they claimed, but to weaken him, to make him dependent on their care, to control his empire, the record label, the publishing rights, the touring revenue. They'd watched him rise from the ghetto to international stardom, and somewhere along the way, their love had turned to envy and bitter calculation. He could have called the police, could have sought revenge. Instead, he channeled everything into the music, creating songs that would outlive any earthly scheme. His band watched in awe, as he transformed their small studio into a temple of sound, laying down tracks with an urgency they'd never seen before. He finished the album in a frenzy of creation, even as his body began to betray him. The doctors found the cancer too late, though sometimes he wondered if they'd been looking at all. In his final months, he performed those prophetic songs for crowds who had no idea they were hearing a dying man's testimony. The album would go on to be his biggest success, its message of redemption and spiritual warfare touching millions. But few knew the real story behind those lyrics, how death had visited his garden months before, warning him in the language of leaves and betrayal. His last words to his son were from Exodus: "The truth cannot be hidden from the righteous." Even now, decades later, fans dissect those final songs, hearing warnings and prophecies in every line. Did the garden's biblical omens truly foretell this reggae legend's fate? Share your guess about this Kingston prophet's identity in the comments below. The dream started in the summer of 1975. He'd wake up tangled in silk sheets at his London mansion, shaken from visions of his own end. "Darling," he told his closest friend over breakfast, "I've seen how it happens, all of it." His band was already legendary, selling out stadiums across the globe. But something about those dreams lit a fire in him. He became obsessed with creating an epic, a rock opera that would blend his classical training with his theatrical flair. His bandmates thought he'd lost his mind when he explained the concept. A 6-minute operatic masterpiece about facing death, radio would never play it. The record label executives shook their heads. It was commercial suicide. But he could be fierce when he believed in something. "The dreams are telling me this is my legacy," he insisted during yet another argument in the studio. "This is how they'll remember me." The recording sessions stretched for months. He drove his bandmates to exhaustion, demanding countless takes, layering hundreds of vocal tracks until the song became the epic he saw in his mind. The studio engineers were amazed by his precision, how he could visualize every note, every harmony, every crescendo before it was recorded. His classical background helped him write the complexest orchestrations, but something deeper drove the story, a narrative about a man confronting mortality. Between takes, he'd tell his producer about the dreams, how vivid they were, how they showed him not just his death, but the impact his music would have after he was gone. "This song is my gift to the future," he said, one night after a particularly grueling session. "My little piece of immortality." When the epic was finally released, it changed rock music forever. The blend of opera and rock was unlike anything audiences had heard before, but few knew about the dreams that inspired it, or how he'd fought to preserve every note of his vision. Years later, as his health began to fail, the dreams returned. But they were different now, said less frightening, more like glimpses of his own legacy. He kept working until the end, recording vocals whenever he had the strength. His bandmates noticed how he'd choose songs about mortality, about leaving something behind that would last forever. In his final days, he was calm, almost serene. "The dreams prepared me for this," he told his manager. "I've already seen how the story ends." He passed away in London in 1991, but the operatic masterpiece he created after those first dreams became his eternal testament. Even now, decades later, audiences around the world raise their voices to its chorus, just as he dreamed they would. His bandmates still marvel at how he knew, how those summer dreams in 1975 showed him not just his ending, but how to transform it into something timeless. The song remains a 6-minute suite about mortality that defied every rule of popular music. But for those who knew about the dreams, it's something more. A prophecy in musical form, crafted by a man who saw his own fate and chose to face it with theatrical grandeur. This theatrical rock god turned his dreams of death into an operatic masterpiece. Think you know who it is? Share your guess in the comments. The diary entry was dated exactly 1 month before it happened. "I know when it ends," he wrote in his neat Swedish handwriting, "and I'm starting to feel okay about it." At 28, he was already a legend in the electronic music world, selling out massive venues from Stockholm to Sydney. But the touring had taken its toll. The constant lights, the endless nights, the pressure to keep the crowds moving. His family saw the changes in him first. During rare visits home to Stockholm, he'd talk about his growing certainty that 28 would be his last year. "It's not sad," and he'd tell his concerned sister. "It's just what's going to happen." The prediction started after his first major health scare. The punishing tour schedule, sometimes 5 shows in 5 different countries in 5 days, had left him with severe anxiety and a dependency on alcohol to perform. After a particularly bad panic attack in Miami, he began writing about his premonitions. His manager found him one morning in his hotel room, surrounded by journal pages covered in time frames and calculations. He'd mapped out his remaining months with an eerie precision, even noting the exact week he believed it would end. The music changed too. His new tracks took on a different tone, less about the euphoria of dance floors and more about finding peace amid chaos. In studio sessions, he talked about wanting to create something that would help others struggling with the same demons that followed him from stage to stage. His final tour was a blur of sold-out shows and sleepless nights. After each performance, he'd retreat to his laptop, documenting his thoughts, his fears, and his growing acceptance of what he saw coming. The last diary entries were almost serene. He wrote about finding a kind of peace in knowing, about no longer feeling the need to fight against a fate he'd glimpsed so clearly. His family begged him to stay home, to rest, to fight whatever darkness was calling him. But he spoke about it with such calm certainty, like someone who'd looked behind the curtain and made peace with what they saw. The last week, he retreated to a quiet place, far from the pulsing lights and pressing crowds that had defined his life. His final diary entry spoke of feeling more clarity than ever before. He wrote about the responsibility of having a gift, how the same talent that let him move millions had also shown him glimpses of his own ending. When the news broke, his fans were devastated, but his family wasn't surprised. They'd watched him document his own ending for months, mapping it out with the same precision he'd once used to build his complex musical arrangements. His last album was released posthumously, a collection of songs that felt less like club anthems and more like a gentle goodbye. In the years since, other young DJs have talked about the pressure of the lifestyle, the toll it takes to keep millions dancing night after night, but few knew about the quiet prophecies he wrote in those private journals, or how calmly he walked toward the ending he'd seen coming. The final diary remains with his family in Stockholm, its pages filled with the thoughts of a young man who chose to face his fate with open eyes, leaving behind not just music that moved crowds, but a testament to finding peace in the hardest of truths. From Stockholm to global stardom, this electronic music pioneer mapped out his final chapter with eerie precision. Tell us who you think he was in the comments below.